Hello, and welcome. This is Tower of Time. Now, this one caught my interest pretty much immediately due to the fact that it was being described as a sort of hybrid cRPG, aRPG, and I love my alphabet soup RPGs because, well, I play pretty much every RPG I can get my hands on since role-playing games are a sort of pleasure of mine in every aspect, but cRPGs especially, having experienced sort of renaissance as of the last few years, are a big deal to me because I love them. I loved them back in the day and I love them now. This one, however, was, like I said, being described a bit differently because of its sort of, I guess you could sort of call it modal gameplay due to the fact that its main exploration layer and its combat layer are very separate, and you'll see what I mean when we actually get into it later. But really, it's not like very many other games I've played. However, the ones I would describe it as similar to. Unfortunately, not very many other people have played either. I would really describe it, if I had to, as similar to something like aRClash Legacy or Kin. And if you've heard of either of those games, congratulations, you're one of like 5 other people in the universe that ever have. Really, probably most similar to aRClash Legacy. And what I mean by that is it's really got that, that party-based, kind of slightly more simplistic building, character building, and everything of something like an action RPG like Diablo. Well, it's the simplistic building like Diablo, but the party-based of a cRPG like Baldur's Gate or something like that. I'm screwing with my recording software here. But really, it's, it's a combination of basically something like Baldur's Gate and Diablo in terms of its kind of mechanics and the like, is the best way I would personally describe it. And, well, here it is. So the game takes place in 2 main layers. You have your exploration layer here, where you can venture around this tower. And the tower is an interesting part of the game in that it's sort of upside down. And the lore states that it's basically this giant magical tower that has been buried in the earth upside down. And you are descending it, but rather ascending it because of this. And each floor, each level, is very different from the last and has very different enemy types and very different puzzle types and just a different theme and everything from the last. And then you have this part that you're about to see here, which is the combat layer, which takes place in a sort of different area, almost in like a JRPG-esque way, where you actually, transfer into a different part, into a sort of arena-like area and do the combat. And of course, you also have character building with loot and stats and skill trees and things of that nature, which is pretty cool. There's a lot of loot to be found in various rarities, as you can see here, denoted by color, and we'll get into more of that in a bit because I want to show you the combat right out of the gate. The combat here is with a bunch of orcs, which were the enemies of the 2nd floor, and this is the 3rd floor that I'm in right now, but there are a couple of straggler orcs for lore reasons on the 2nd floor. The combat is definitely the highlight of the game. It's pretty strategic and has a quite pretty variety of arenas that you can go into, and the arenas are often based around where you actually encounter the enemies. So if you fight in a library, then the arena itself will look like a big library and things of that nature. So this is a very craggy, kind of magical looking area. And as you can see, the combat doesn't really waste any time in getting started. It's pretty hectic, but it is a well, I was going to say real-time with pause, but that's not really the case, like Baldur's Gate-esque. It's actually sort of a real-time with slow combat system. You can slow time by hitting spacebar to sort of take an inventory of what in the world is going on, because you are always outnumbered. There are a lot of enemies coming at you, and there's a lot to take in, because you have 4 characters, each with different weapon sets and different capabilities. You also have 4 abilities on each character, and each ability has 2 mutually exclusive lines that you can develop them through. And each of these lines will alter which ability does what. For instance, you saw me activate a fire ability on the archer lady there. And the 2 different... Normally what that does really is just enchant her bow with fire arrows. But the 2 mutually exclusive lines that you can take that through will either change it to also up the critical chance significantly of that, or turn them into explosive fire arrows. Which obviously in this area, due to the kind of large number of the orcs like the very significant number of orcs in tight groups, I chose the fire arrows. And there's another really interesting, I suppose you could say, gimmick of the game right there, are the draw abilities. There are several abilities that characters have that allow you to draw shapes on the ground and cast different types of skills in those shapes. She has one that calls down a giant rain of arrows in whatever shape you draw. And another character, our tank, has a skill that puts up a big rock wall in a specific shape. And you can probably think of pretty unique uses for those skills later on. And as the story goes on here, I'm going to just talk some more because, I don't want to really try and spoil too much of the story, but I will say the story is actually not bad. It's not a throwaway story at all just for, dungeon crawling reasons. It actually is fairly interesting because the tower itself is genuinely quite cool. There's a lot to discover here, and the side quests and puzzles and things, and yes, there are actual puzzles and side quests worth doing, are quite fun, and there's a lot to them. There are quite a few on each floor, and they're worth doing, not just because they're fun, but because the rewards are quite good. There are lots of unique items and epic items that you can get from doing so, and they're worth having because some of the combat actually gets quite difficult. And in terms of the combat, one of the reasons I say that it's probably the highlight of the game is how tactical it is. Another reason that Baldur's Gate and other games like that, cRPG style games come up is you do have to actually understand the strengths and usages of each character and their particular skill set. Every character is meant for a specific usage, although due to the fact that there are lots of abilities that you can slot into each character's 4 slots, they don't just have 4 skills, there are about, I think, 7 or 8 for each character as they level up, and you can actually, you choose which ones you want in those 4 slots. And of course then there are the 2 mutually exclusive upgrades for each ability. That gives each character a lot of variety in what they can actually do, but they still have a specific use. For instance, my tank, the one that I'm using as a tank, he is basically going to be a tank of some kind no matter what, but exactly what he does while he's doing that can change. For instance, I have him spec'd right now as basically the really strong frontline tank with some damage capability because I gave him an interrupting sort of bleeding wave ability, and that earthen slowing wave that you can draw, and some other stuff. So basically he's meant to be up front, making sure that enemies, really strong enemies that have some pretty potent attacks, can't cast them as often, and also to protect some of our back, more squishy characters with that, a couple of his other skills, like upping our armor and drawing those big walls, to help make sure that some other enemy waves can't necessarily get to our squishier characters as quickly. Basically, he's sort of a limiter. He's a tank and a limiter that allows some of our other characters some extra time to deal a bunch of damage before some of the other enemy waves crash into them. And this is probably why the game is just so enjoyable to me as a whole, because there's a lot of room for strategy and unique kind of character builds. You sort of choose what you want to do with your party. And there are more characters than this. There aren't just 4, there are 7, question mark, maybe 8, I can't remember. I don't have any more than this right now. But there are more than this that you find later on. And there's a lot of room for making your own party and doing what you want with them. Not to mention the fact that the arenas get quite varied and interesting as well, and some of them, especially in Floor 1 for instance, some of the really difficult fights at the time require you to do some very specific things. It actually reminded me of MMO raids, playing like Final Fantasy XI and stuff like that. You have to do things like avoid lots of big circles on the ground and line of sight specific abilities. There were these elite wraiths that had an attack that drained your health and healed them really fast, like really, really fast. If you just stood there and let them drain your health, you would die in about 3 or 4 seconds. And you couldn't kill them fast enough because they were healing themselves while doing this, so you couldn't just, like, overpower them, really. I'm sure by now, since I'm a much higher level than I was at the time, I could go back and just, like, stomp the battle if I wanted to, but if I wanted to do it at the time, you had to employ quite a lot of strategy, and you had to basically be constantly moving your group of, I only had 2 characters at the time, around, and use the terrain, or that earth wall ability, usually a combination of the two, to consistently line of sight these big life-drawing beams in order to make sure that none of them were draining your health for very long. And there were also several optional boss fights that went this way, where you had to be line of sighting abilities, using that right there, that big earth wall, to do things like block certain groups from getting to you at the same time as other groups, so you weren't facing them at the same time, because they had auras that stacked on top of each other, so you didn't want the enemies to be all fighting you at once, or else their attacks would just stack up to be much too damaging for you to tank all at once. That was just too much. And also things like drawing that wall to funnel enemies into a very small area so that my archer could use her explosive arrow to deal with them all at once. Stuff like that. There's a lot of strategy and interesting usages that you can find for all of your attacks in combination with all of the other characters and all of those passive upgrades and all of the terrain in the arenas. It's genuinely a really enjoyable combat experience. And I really, really like it. Not to mention, there is more than just this one combat mode. There's actually several different types of fights that you can do. This is just one of them. This just, there are enemies, now go kill them. There's actually several other ones. Like, for instance, there's some that have towers in them, kind of like, I don't know, a MOBA or a tower defense. Only the towers are not yours, they are the enemies, and you have to find a way to kill the towers. They have different elements and different attacks depending on what their element is. And you've got to, face waves of enemies and try and kind of weave around these towers, because they are quite strong, while facing the enemies, and find the right time to kill the towers, because they count towards the enemy defeated percentage, so you have to kill them too, eventually. It's up to you when you do it, but you have to do it eventually. There are ambush game modes, where sometimes enemies just show up when you're venturing around the exploration layer, and they will actually put cages around some of your party members, and you start the battle. By the way, these you cannot flee from, you have to actually fight. You may notice there's a withdrawal button where you can not choose to fight right now, but ambushes you cannot withdraw from, you have to fight them if they show up. Where you start the battle with at least one, sometimes two, and I assume later in the game maybe even three of your heroes in cages, and you have to balance the fight between trying to damage the cages enough to break out your friends, and fighting off the waves of enemies coming at you so you can, live. So that's an interesting one to do. They're a little bit scary at first because, you're afraid of not having enough DPS with half of your party caged up, but also trying to make sure to not ignore the enemies too long to where they build up to an unkillable force. They're pretty fun and a kind of an adrenaline-fueled way of fighting, because you're, lacking some of your abilities and your damage. You've also got a defensive game mode where there will be these crystals that you have to defend, and enemies will actually go after them in almost exclusivity. Unless they take a lot of damage from one of your heroes, they will go after these crystals and not after you at all, and you have to defend them. There are usually at least two of the crystals, and you will lose if both of them are destroyed. So it's a sort of defense game mode where you're trying to use a lot of your high threat generation abilities and lots of very high DPS, like high mana burning abilities, to get their attention, using lots of blocking and summoning up lots of golems and things and elementals just to get in the way and try and stem the tide of enemies. There's even a swarm game mode where a bunch of smaller enemies come in very large waves all at once. It's quite a varied game, actually. And as far as the exploration layer goes, there's a lot of optional quests and puzzles that you can solve to get special items. As you can see, I've got lots of orange items. Those are uniques. And a lot of those I've gained from doing optional boss battles that I've just found, elite battles that you can find, and some other optional stuff like this right here. This is a forge that you can find, which they're all single use, you can only use them once, but they allow you to upgrade an item, just one, to the next tier up. So for instance, this blue right here, this ring that I quite like, if I upgrade it in here, it becomes a purple, an epic. There is a crafting system. Also, you see all those colored shards. You cannot sell things, but you can disassemble things into those shards. So, a purple item will disassemble into purple shards, and so on and so forth. There is one particular battle mode that I have to admit that I do not like very much, which are the portal battles. I think they are very terribly designed, to be totally honest with you. Basically, there are portals strewn about a battlefield, and they're meant to be, those are some new enemies for the third floor, by the way, so when I figured out what they were like. Portal battles are difficult. I don't dislike them just because they're hard, I dislike them because I don't think they're balanced correctly, personally. Essentially, there are portals around the battlefield, usually 2 or 3. Before I explain them, I want to explain this, though. This is the city, and this is how you actually make your characters better. This is worth explaining. You may notice that you don't gain experience from actually killing things. The city is used to actually level your characters up and things like that. These are buildings that you have to upgrade in order to actually upgrade your characters. And this is how you do that. You spend the gold that you obtain from battles and from finding it and things like that in quests to actually upgrade your characters, and when you upgrade them, their stats will increase, and they will get things you can, points that you can spend on their stats and on their skill tree. So that's actually how you level them up. You have to train them, not get experience. There is no experience. You can also forge new weapons and equipment like that if you wish. You can also enchant purple items with enchantable slots. You can find these blue scrolls to gain new enchantments to actually put on things, which is pretty cool. So another important part of exploration is to find not just loot, but things to make your loot better. There are loads of enchantments, some of them are very cool, and each enchantment also has multiple tiers usually. There are a couple of other ways to gain enchantments as well. There are these challenge missions you can do to gain new enchantments. For instance, there's one that I have an enchantment slot for. And I believe you can also overwrite an enchantment slot. But if a weapon comes pre-enchanted, then you cannot do that, I believe. It has to be an empty one. And you can also, this is a very interesting part of the game, you may have noticed those empty gray squares like that up there in the very top middle of the screen next to an item portrait. This is a way that you can actually use to improve items. So every sort of intrinsic value on an item can be sort of forged and improved using those shards. This is sort of like a almost Path of Exile-esque item crafting system, only it's guaranteed and not using orbs. But, you know, whatever, it's similar. And you can just put any item except for a unique, uniques are too good to be improved this way, into this slot and use those shards to actually improve it. And that's one actual advantage of using the Forge, is that normal items actually have a limit on how many of those slots they'll have, and the better quality the item, the fewer slots they have to improve. Normally purple items only have 1 slot, but because that ring didn't actually start as a purple item, it has more slots now because I improved it, so it didn't, they don't actually lose slots. So this allows you to basically improve the base quality of an item. It's sort of like just forging it up a bit. It's kind of a neat system, actually. It allows you to get to improve the quality, the base statistical quality of an item, and make it better than it already was. And maybe even improve the specific build that you had going for a character, or sort of shore up some of their weaknesses because of the negatives that an item may have. Because there are very good items that carry negatives along with them, especially uniques. And then back into the tower we go. So, yeah, as I was talking about the portal battles, there will be portals at the far end of the arena, and they will have monsters spawning around them. They'll also have countdowns on the side of the screen that tell you when they're going to rush you, essentially. And they have circles around the portals. If you step in the circles, the monsters will attack you, but if you stay away, the monsters will stay around the portals. And if you wait until the timers around the portals get to 0, it doesn't matter if you step in the circles or not, all the monsters will come and get you. So that's basically how it works. However, the way that they're designed kind of betrays this a little bit. You would think that maybe the way that it would work is if the timers went to 0, all of the monsters spawn and come and get you, but that's actually not how it works. Monsters are constantly spawning around these portals no matter what the timers say, and there's no real indication of how often these monsters will spawn. It's at regular intervals, even though it seems random, but there's no indication of what the interval is. And the way they're designed is basically no matter how quick you are at destroying one portal, by the time you get to the next one, no matter which one you choose, it will be so just horrendously surrounded by an enormous army of monsters that you just get Zerg rushed every time. you can beat these, and as you saw, I've beaten all of them so far because I have 100% on all the other floors, but they are really hard, like much, much harder than any other kind of battle. And like I said, I'm not complaining because they're difficult. I don't mind difficult battles. I've done all the other optional battles and things. It's just that they're so difficult that they seem like kind of overtuned kind of difficult. Not like difficult in a fair way, difficult in a this is just like obscenely kind of why is it designed like this way. They're not fun battles to me. I dread doing them, and I try and hold them back as long as I can and do them as late on the floor as I can, so I'm like too powerful. But that's difficult to do because they're usually in the way of places you need to go. These aren't optional side battles, these are things you have to do to progress. And more often than not, they're in the way that you need to go, so you can't really wait to do them later. Oftentimes you have to do them when you find them, or very near when you find them. And sometimes these timers kind of break their own rules to where some of the timers are set really low to where monsters are constantly streaming across the portal at you when you're trying to do some of the other portals, and you might say, well, okay, then kill that portal first so it doesn't do that. Well, if you do that, then by the time you get to the other portals, they're going to be surrounded by like 30 really big tough monsters, so you'd rather kill the big tough monster portal first, right? Well, if you do that, then the small annoying portal that's rushing monsters is going to be rushing. You see what I mean? They're really annoyingly designed missions that I just do not find fun. They're just constantly spawning monsters, and I was talking about how really interesting the design of the battles is, with all this tactical variety and interesting ways to beat each battle and how fun it is. But there is sort of an amount of diminishing return that happens with how you're actually able to do that when there are so many enemies on screen that really no amount of tactical variety matters anymore, because there's just a huge screen of enemies of every variety that it doesn't matter what you do, you just sort of have to try and brave the wave and hope you live. There is no splitting them up or doing interesting various things to try and face them like you would at any normal amount of enemies, because it's basically like 2 battles worth of enemies coming at you all at once. There's not really much you can do against that besides just sit there, dig in, and try and live. And I don't find that interesting personally. But really, that's so far my only complaint against the game, is just that specific type of battle. Other than that, I've found the entire game to be genuinely very, very interesting. And very compelling. The story is fun. The crafting and itemization of the game is actually pretty cool. I like the enchantments. They make a big difference. The enchantments aren't afraid to be pretty big differences and actually quite fun to use. And the actual character variety, not only do the characters themselves have personalities and are quite fun to use and bring into battle, but they have a lot of abilities that are different from each other. None of the abilities have felt, what's the word I'm looking for, redundant. And here's an ambush, by the way. None of the abilities have felt redundant or unnecessarily like constrained, like they feel they need to be kind of competitively balanced, if that makes sense, or too weak. They've all felt quite potent, and I love the fact that there's that mutually exclusive upgrade for every single ability, which adds a lot of variety. So I think Tower of Time is worth your time if you like RPGs, and if you're looking for a kind of interesting difference in your sort of cRPG-like or that sort of a party-based RPG experience. If you're looking for something like that, this is a really, really good one. It is genuinely interesting, and it kind of brings me back to some of the older days of games like this, and there aren't very many of them around anymore. So definitely give it a try. It's kind of like another one of those brings me back to the PS2 days kinds of games, and I would love more of those. It's definitely one of them. It's only $25 on Steam. I will of course link you in the description below this video. And there's a lot here for that price, I feel like. I should stop smacking my desk. And, there's, I think, about 9 floors to this tower, and every floor is pretty huge. It actually reminds me of something like Heroes of Might and Magic as well, and which actually makes me want like a random skirmish mode. You know how, I'm sure I'm not the only one that did that, where you love doing the random skirmishes instead of the story at some point? Even though the story of this is really good. I would like a giant floor that is randomly generated, where you got to choose 4 of any of the characters, and you just went in there and explored it, and everything was randomized every time. as like a game mode, that would be really cool. I have no idea if that's actually possible for them to create, but I would play the crap out of that. That would be really cool. So yeah, that's Tower of Time. If it looks interesting to you, feel free to check it out. And this battle goes pretty well, actually. I do end up nailing it. But yeah, that's an example of an ambush, yet another one of the different battle modes. So the game's not afraid to mix it up and throw some interesting things at you. But screw those portal battles, seriously. Thank you very much for watching, and I'll see you guys next time.